It's live. All right. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Sorry. Welcome, everybody, to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Emily Hencken Ritter, and I'm an associate professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. I'm also the director of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. This is a colloquium that is connected to the Peace Science Society International, which is an organization for those studying and interested in the study of peace and the way that we can, and understanding conflict, that we can better achieve peace. Today, I'm joined by Howard Liu, who is a graduate, a recent graduate.
Going to graduate,
about to graduate,
yeah.
PhD student at Duke University. And Howard is presenting a paper today that won the Bremer Award at this most recent Peace Science Society annual meeting for the best graduate student paper at that meeting. And so this is a super exciting paper. And every year we feature the Bremer winner so that people who weren't able to see it at the meeting are able to get a glimpse at this work. So Howard will be presenting that work, and then we are joined by an excellent panel of discussants. We have Christian Davenport, who's professor of political science at University of Michigan. We also have Chris Fariss, who's an assistant professor of political science at Michigan. We have Jacqueline DeMeritt, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of North Texas, and associate professor of political science at George Washington University, Yonatan Lupu. So thank you, everybody, for coming. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Howard. And I would remind everybody who's watching that you can find Howard's paper linked from the Online Peace Science Colloquium website. And you can also get it from Howard's website directly. So with that, take it over.
Thank you. Let me try to share the screen. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? Hello? Can everyone see the screen?
Sorry, you can't see us. Yes, everyone can see it.
Got it. Sorry. Okay. Good. So thank you, everyone, for attending and discussing for this paper. So this paper is about modeling the repression-dissent nexus by using a network approach for this paper. So the puzzle I have for this paper is that, in general, I studied protest and repression. But when I was looking at cases, I find many incidences that protesters, they are not just deciding they are going to protest or not, and government is not just deciding they are going to repress people or not, but actually both actors are employing a wide range of tactics when they are confronting each other. For example, for protesters, they can decide to have a more peaceful sitting or a demonstration. Also, they can opt for a more violent riots or violent protest when they are contesting the government. For the government side, it's also the case. They can use more or less violent approaches, such as use water cannon to disperse protesters, or they can escalate it to more violent approaches, such as beating up the protesters. So the key thing is that these tactics are not independent of each other, but actually they are interrelying on each other's responses. For example, governments, they can not only react, but also anticipate protester behavior, and they craft their responses. It's also the same situation for protesters when they are trying to craft their strategies against the government. So we have a intrinsically interconnected strategy that are employed by the state and dissents. And this analytical challenge that is centered by this paper. So the key challenge is that how do mobilization behaviors interact with state responses, such as protest, such as repression, and how are able to study this interaction between different types of actions employed by the state, but also protesters. I think this question has been long debating in the political science and also sociology literature, people trying to understand how can we be able to model or understand this repression and dissent nexus. And this paper, I'm trying to propose an approach to kind of address the difficulty, a part of the difficulty presented by this nexus. So what do we learn from literature already? There are generally two approaches to model this repression-dissent nexus. The first approach is taking more traditional perspective by seeing action and reaction as a chain of actions. For example, dissidents, their actions will lead to government reactions, and government reactions will lead to further dissident reaction, and so on. So many scholars in this approach, approach are using sequential modeling to try to capture this reciprocal patterns between protester behavior and government's reactions. And another new approach is taking a different perspective on studying this dynamic. So scholars like Ritter and Conrad, in their paper, they're trying to study the effect of preventive repression. So there are two types of dissidents. One type is the unobserved ones, which may be accidentally be preempted by repression. So we never observe these to be happening. And the second approach is more, it's a observed dissent, which means that the prevention failed to prevent this protest to go down the street, or there was actually no prevention at all. So scholar in this line of work trying to use instrumental variable approach to exclude the effect of preventive repression and to trying to study what are the effect of the observed dissent on the consequence, on the subsequent repression. So these scholar has built a solid knowledge for us to advance our understanding of the repression, dissent, their interactive dynamic. But there's little work on trying to model the diversity of tactics, even though many conflict or peace science scholars keep advocating that it's very important to study the repertoire of contention or different types of tactics. I think the problem is in part that because when we are trying to fit these multi-equational models or instrumental variable models, over time we have to compress this observation into binary choices, such as protest or not, using violence or not, using action or non-actions, to kind of be able to fit in this model. So the observation is compressed into a binary or an index representation. However, in reality, when we are looking at cases, we know that there are many tactics being available for actors. For example, for dissident, they can go to protest, they can occupy squares, destroy properties, also attack police. For the state, they can also choose from a variety of repertoire of tactics. For example, they can mobilize police, they can accommodate protesters, they can make concession, but also they can escalate to disperse or threat to disperse, or actually arresting people, assault, or killing dissidents. So there are a wide range of strategy that can be employed. So if we miss this diversity of tactics, we are unable to study this complex interplay between the state and dissent, and are unable to examine the micro process of how conflict escalates to higher level violence and limit our ability to predict future interactions. So what should we do about it? So on previous slides, I already showed that there is some intrinsic interactive dependency between repression and dissent. And I would say when I was looking at this kind of puzzle, I say, why don't we use network analysis? Because networks are a great tool to model the interdependency between observations, and we can apply this network toolkit to help us to unbox the puzzle of this interdependency between repression and dissent. But what we need to do is we have to tweak the idea of network a little bit differently. So the traditional networks, usually we have nodes as actors, and their linkages are the interactions. For example, on the Facebook, we have nodes as people, and their linkages are whether they are friends or not. So in this traditional type of network, we are only able to study one type of interactions because the nodes are the actors. However, if we use a different approach by treating nodes as actions, then the linkages of the actions are their co-occurrence in an event or in a year. So we can use the interaction. We can use the co-occurrence of actions, study what kinds of actions are more likely to cluster together. And this way, we can use network analysis to study multiple types of interaction rather than just one type. And there are some important recent works, such as Fariss and Schneckenberg. They start to reconceptualize networks and their nodes as actions. For example, in their work, they treat human rights violations as nodes and study their interdependencies. But their work focusing on the state side repression and on the country level. But further extension can be made to model not just state, but also state's interaction with protesters or dissidents at the event level, so we can see what kind of actions are targeting each other and how they interact. And then we use network toolkits to model or find the patterns of conflict escalation. For example, when protests are likely to escalate to mutual conflict spiral by both sides. Okay, sorry. So here I want to build a action-reaction network by using real-world data. And I use a NAFCO data, which is nonviolent and violent campaign and outcome data sets. It contains anti-government campaigns in authoritarian regimes, and also it's a cross-national data sets from 1990 to 2012 with more than 36,000 resistant events. And it is event data. There's a event ID that indicate whether the stories have the same story title, whether they're in the same location, whether they are having the same actor sets, such as the state and dissidents. And there can be multiple actions in one event. And I call the co-occurring tactics in one event as interlinked tactics in my network approach. So here's trying to give an example of what data look like. So for example, in Algeria, 2002, July 25th, there are clashes between Berber minorities with the police. And initially, a Berber minority was demanding government to release their leader and saying that if you want to release, there's an issue ultimatum that we are going to protest. And then they went on the protest and march in defiance of ban that government saying that you cannot protest. And government mobilized police and deployed police to deter the protesters. And there were clashes between protests and police, some skirmishes happening, and then police were using tear gas to disperse these protesters. So you can see that in one event, there are multiple action reactions that are going on to targeting each other. And we can use network analysis to try to find what are the actions that often co-occur to each other. Here's a flow chart that's trying to give you a general picture of how I built this network. In the first stage, we have the events, which we see in the previous slides. And then in each event, if there are actions that co-occur in one event, I assign a link. And then by collecting all these events and action links, we can build network slides on different timestamps. The time span can be a year, 12 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, depending on researchers, their research target. But here I'm using a 12 months X example. So after we have several network slides on different timestamps, we can extract network information from each slides. For example, on the group level, we can see what are the tactics that often associate with protest, if they are in the same community with protesters, protest tactics. And also on the nodal level, we can see what are the important nodes that often contribute to conflict escalation. So both group and nodal level information can be extracted. By finding clusters, I use a commonly used community detection model based on Louvain modularity maximization. But for the sake of time, I will skip this part. So here are some examples. For example, I used the data in Egypt in 2008. We generally can find 3 clusters. And since we are interested in protest clusters, we focus on the protest one. And we see that in 2008 Egypt, protests often co-occur with government arresting people and government mobilizing police force, and also dissidents are threatening to protest. but we never actually see protests escalate to higher level of violence. So it can mean that, it can imply that government preventive interventions such as arresting people or mobilizing police are actually effective in deterring escalating to violence in this time period. However, in different time period, for example, in 2011 Egypt, we know that there's a wave of Arab Spring protests going on in the region. We see lots of interaction with different tactics that was observed in the data set, and there are multiple clusters we can find. And zooming to protest cluster we're interested in, we find that protests often co-occur with a government arrest, government assaulting people, dissidents rejecting proposal, cooperative proposals, and dissidents sometimes damage properties, dissidents sometimes escalate to killing government personnel and government killing dissidents. So in this time period, we see a lot of conflict escalation that leads to higher level of violence, which is different from different time period that we saw in 2008. So these two examples are trying to show that by using tactic data and network approach, we're now not bounded by the binary choice that we used previously in empirical model. Right now, we can actually dive into different interaction of tactics and look at the patterns of them. And here is my first application. So I want to kind of validate this method by using some application, for example, predicting state repression. If the logic of conflict escalation and how it relates in the interplay of each other is correct, we should probably see a better prediction by incorporating the prior information so that we can have a better prediction of the future interactions. And prediction is not only validate this method, but also provide a real world policy value for us. For example, if we already see a protest on the street, what a reaction for the government we can expect? Or more importantly, what types of state responses can we expect that it will be employed to deter protesters? So in order to do the predictions, the data set are separated in two sets, the training set and the test set. In general, represent 80% of the data on the training set and 20% of the data in test sets. And the unit is on the event level, so we can predict protest events. And the dependent variable is different types of state repression against protesters. The main predictors are the network variable that was derived from the network approach on the repressive tactics. On the group level is community assignments. It equals 1 if the repressive tactic is assigned to the same community with protest tactics. And the nodal level information includes centrality measures so that we can see how important a node can contribute to protest escalations. And all the variables are like for a year and also done 3, 6, 9 month lags so that it can ask to validation.
Howard, about 3 more minutes.
Okay. So I will also incorporate additional standard covariates in the model that are deemed to be important to predict state repression. So some features incorporated are campaign goals, number of participants, and other structural variables such as grievances, resource mobilization, or political opportunities. These factors also deemed important to predict state violence. And then the model is estimated by logic regression. So 2 models are being estimated. The first is the network model, which incorporate not only the covariates that was indicated by the literature, covariates that are important to state repression, but also network variables. And the baseline is only incorporating the covariates. In that panel, you can see that in the ROC curve, it presents a much better prediction performance compared to the baseline model. And in the precision and recall curve, which is precisely to evaluate the prediction on the ones, it also presents that it has a better prediction performance. In the second application, in addition to prediction, I also want to evaluate whether this approach can help us to explain the conflict escalation and mutual spiral. And I take the literature literature on electoral violence as example. So in the authoritarian election and violence literature, it tells us that election provide the incentive for both opposition and incumbent to commit violence so that they can use violence to manipulate election results or election process. But how does violence occur? One main driver is that during election, both parties, they are prone to be stimulated by violent activity by the other sides, so that they are more likely to be stimulated, so more likely to use more violence. So in Harris and Little, their 2017 APSR paper, they called it as a conflict spiral effect, where protesters and government, they're both likely to be stimulated and escalate their violence. However, this conflict spiral is often being assumed they're being tested. Here, I'm saying that using this tactic data and network method, we can actually test the relationship, this spiral effect, and this relationship that elections often can lead to a mutual spiral of conflict. I will skip this and jump into the data. So in general, we see that by using the election data, we see that in general, election can motivate more escalatory violence. However, by looking at each individual escalatory actions, we do not see a clear pattern. Some are positive, some are negative, some are significant, others are not. However, if we use the network variable that was derived by this network approach, we say that elections is often associated with a mutual conflict spiral and can also escalate to a lethal spiral to a massive killing. So some quick takeaway from this paper is that interdependencies in repression-dissent is a hard problem, and using node as interaction framework can help us address some of the difficulties by incorporating their inherent interdependencies, by finding the clusters and identifying key tactics that can contribute to escalation of violence. Some broader application can also be applied when researchers have reached interaction data by two sides. For example, in American politics, we can study strategic interplay between executive versus legislative behaviors. In comparative politics, this approach can also be applied to study different rebel insurgent tactics versus state counter-insurgent efforts. And it could be also applied in IR to study military defense on offense dynamic. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Howard. And so we're going to turn it over first to Christian Davenport, who has our first comment.
Sorry, I was muted.
That's okay.
Howard, first, thank you. I want to applaud the effort. There's very few efforts to kind of pull together formal and quant work. I think there's a bias normally towards the last 10 years of people and paying attention to literature. And so you pay attention to the last 10 years and go beyond that. Thank you. And then, of course, some people pay attention to repression, some people pay attention to dissent. That said, I kind of, I say this in the nicest manner as I was part of the problem. I completely disagree with your setup. I don't think it exists anymore. I think the problem that we had was we were lumping together a bunch of different literature, and the stuff you cite, some is at the national level, some is at the organizational level, some is at the individual level. And if you start to sort by that, you'll see more uniform results. So that puzzle that we've generally been using, I think, doesn't really hold up if you're paying attention to those nuances. So for example, people push back with regards to the selective versus indiscriminate stuff. That's only one way of kind of slicing it. But if you look at whether or not selective or indiscriminate repression was used, then this supposed variation that we see actually gets diminished a great deal. And so I don't think you necessarily need that setup or as Will would say, trope to kind of get into it. I think there's something to be said for addressing a more accurate and appropriate characterization of the literature that still gets you to your point. I think the dynamic way in which these things have been modeled, I think that is very underdeveloped in many respects, and I think you're clear on that, and I think that gets you to where you want to go to. But I think the kind of straightforward way that you're trying to get us there, I don't really know that that exists per se when you sort the literature that way. Most people don't do it, but I think that's just I just think folks are just lazy. But the minute you start sorting literature like that, Chris Seller and I had the piece at ASR, and basically someone pushed back and they asked us some question about the literature. So we went back and we sorted everything. And when you sorted everything by the different levels of analysis, then you saw much more kind of like uniform findings. And we were like, oh, wow, that's interesting in and of itself. But, you know, the piece got rejected for another reason, but it was like, it was an interesting exercise.
Has that been written somewhere, that analysis that's done combining those different levels of analysis? Is that something that's been written somewhere?
No, I mean, it's more like a review piece, right? There's no, unless you want to do a perspectives piece, then no one really gave a damn. And you need an invite for the annual review, right? So no one's asked for an annual review piece to kind of do that, but we kind of have it sitting ready to go. But it's like, once you start doing it, it's interesting to kind of see the similarities. But that was actually a small comment, Howard, but I think it was, I think a lot of us have been using that as, you know, a lot part of my career is based on the statement, right? So, and I think we then discovered it, and then kind of like the more you plug it, then you kind of realize, oh, okay, there is some patterns in there, and so this actually goes to your story, right? So I think you can retweak it without doing that. Yeah, I guess it became statement at the end. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's perfect. How?
Yeah. So, actually, really, I'm agree with your statements. So I was entering in this topic in the same way as you did. I see many people feeling it's possible because of find linear, non-linear, positive, negative effects. And many people set up their question in a way that is a puzzle. But I think you are right that my paper is not necessarily need this puzzle in terms of motivating my paper, because my paper is about how to model this interactive dynamic. And it does not necessarily have to say that it was puzzling because there is some linear, non-linear, like mixed finding in literature. And I recently saw your post on more disaggregated analysis on different actor, and you can find more consistent effect on the effect repression. I totally agree. So I think I will definitely rewrite my motivation in the introduction. Thank you.
Is this under review right now?
It was rejected.
Okay, so you have a chance to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Howard, we've talked about this paper before, so you know I really like it. And I have some more detailed comments, but let me start with two kind of high-level things. I think the first one's kind of related to Christian's point, which I totally knew he was going to say, because I did the same thing that you did in a paper 6 years ago that he was a discussant on, and he told me the same thing. And he was right then, and he's still right now. So I'm glad that, if nothing else, he's consistent. So you frame this, there's two things I like in the framing, in the sense that I like framing it as there is this problem of strategic interaction between repression and dissent that we haven't solved it. We know more than I think your introduction lets on, but we haven't really solved it. And then there's this other problem of networked interdependence in the data. And what's puzzling to me about your paper is that you address, the way it's framed is you're essentially saying, by analyzing the network structure of the data, I can get at the fact that the data result from a process of strategic interaction. And that's the part that I don't quite understand, is how does modeling the data as a network overcome the endogeneity problem in the data generating process? So that's the first question to you. The second is less of a question and more of a comment, which is that I think that the front end of the paper needs a lot more conceptualizing. You kind of go from this general framing to very, very quickly talking about operationalization. But I think that for a lot of readers who either aren't experts in the repression-dissent nexus or aren't experts in network analysis, I think a lot of people are going to have weak intuition for some of the concepts here. And the way I would suggest doing this conceptualizing is use the lit review as a way of conceptualizing. Use the lit review to clarify the concepts you're working with, because I think they come from previous work, but you haven't drawn it out. So, you know, some of the key concepts that I think you need to explain better are things like these clusters. I think most people are going to have really weak intuition for what these clusters are conceptually, and you can draw that out a little better, as well as things like repertoires of repression and dissent. I think maybe everyone on this call probably kind of knows that off the top of their head, but most people don't. And I think if you want to reach more people, you need to sort of draw those concepts out a little more clearly, and you can use a lit review for that.
I have direct points on this from Christian and then Jackie.
So my two, Jan prompted something. Increasingly, I've come to view kind of the endogeneity statement as one reflexive, but I think it's kind of a claim that eliminates both theoretical exploration and empirical investigation. So I think you don't necessarily have to go there, and I think you're positioned to do that. But then it made me wonder certain things, right? Are all forms and levels of repression equally likely to impact dissent and vice versa? I don't think so. And so I think some of the literature can help guide you in that direction. The other quick thing was like, when you start getting to the related to Jan's argument about under-conceptualization, I found that as well. So I think what you really have is a co-evolutionary story. And a lot of the kind of action-reaction stuff that you utilize didn't capture some of that. So I'm thinking of Pam Oliver and Dan Meyer's piece on co-evolution would be very useful. And that would help you kind of sort out both the literature and then kind of where your setup is going, and then how one could interpret those figures, which I think that was under discussed, but I think I was underprepared to kind of get to that kind of explosiveness with regards to the characterizations. Actually, it reminded me of Hoover and Karolewski's model, and I think it was in JCR. They also had a book, but I'll stop there. So, but I definitely want to support Jan's conception of a clear conceptualization up front to help guide the reader about kind of like where they're going and to deal with some of these broader kind of like setup issues. But co-evolution, I think, is what you have.
Jackie.
I also wanted to piggyback on the point Jan phrased it as a lot of people won't have a good intuition for this stuff. My comment on that was a little bit higher level, which is that the audience for this paper isn't yet super clear to me. And that's because a lot of the stuff you write about repression assumes background knowledge in network analysis, and a lot of the stuff you write about network analysis assumes background knowledge in repression literature. And so what I would really push you to do is think about which of those two audiences you want to speak to. And if it's the peace science audience, then you need to tell this story in a way that has value for people who don't know or care about network analysis as a method. It needs heart and soul, because there's so much of value there. And I just think that you need to hit us over the head and punch us in the gut with why this is so useful.
Okay, Jan on that, and then I'll turn it over to Howard.
I have a short comment relevant to what Jackie pointed out, which is one thing that is missing from this paper are proper nouns. And this is actually a comment that I used to get a lot when I was at your stage, Howard, because I sort of tend to think about things in the abstract and would write papers that look a lot like this paper, where the only proper noun is that I saw was France when you spelled out Agence France Presse, and then Africa also in the name of the data set. But there's no actual facts about events in proper nouns. And for better or worse, people want that. And I think a lot of your readers need that to get a sense of what it is you're talking about. I'm not saying you need to do extensive case studies, but examples here and there, I think for most readers are very helpful, and I think will help address what I heard from Jackie's comment.
I mean, I generally agree, especially when it comes to network analysis, that examples can help us think about how things are connected and how you're conceptualizing those connections. Fariss has a two-finger.
Thanks. This is a comment related to Jan's point about proper nouns, which I think is good advice. Relatedly, I was expecting to see more coverage of each of the tactics. So each of the actions that are categories of behavior by the dissidents and the state that the NAVCO data set covers. I expected that discussion because I believe substantively knowing more about each of those tactics is going to help us understand why they will co-occur or not co-occur together. And I think that type of discussion needs to be a part of any kind of examples, because the network approach is a way of systematically understanding those links, how those tactics are co-occur or not, and then the examples are going to help situate those patterns for the reader, I think.
Christian.
First, you all are helping to remind me why I love our group, why I love our community, so thank you. Second, this discussion is reminding me why I don't like network analysis. So,
so Christian's the one you need to convince, Howard.
which is really strange. But so for example, interconnected nodes lacks the intentionality of repertoires for me. Okay, so it's like you're giving me relationships, but the relationships are taken towards a particular end, and I lose the sense of the end, in part connected to kind of like Jan's comment about pushing you with, if not that I want you to do cases, right? But I'm just like, the strategy that that states and challengers are trying to engage in is for a particular end, and what you're calling co-occurrence is their repertoire of activities that they've selected to get them towards that particular end. But that degree of intentionality is kind of like lost. So you start talking about co-occurrence, and I'm just kind of like, okay, so I see these two events used by a side against the other side that's now using these three. I don't know objectives. I don't know evolution. I don't know whether or not they think it's effective. I don't know what happened previously. So the action reaction stuff that Will was doing was really kind of like, first the side took a turn, and then you had another turn and another side, and then it kind of went. But from that, you could go to, by using these four strategies, you could tell that the opponent was trying to do this, and in response, these three tactics got you that. And so I lose that in the kind of both the setup and then when I get to the images, because I'm looking at your images, I'm not just looking at these things kind of fired up at the same time. I'm trying to figure out what that side is doing, but you haven't given me the language to understand what co-occurrence would mean in terms of that tactical repertoire. So it's kind of two, but I think it's related to kind of like this setup issue, this kind of like theoretical setup, because once you get me into the weeds of looking at your figures, which are cool, I'm just kind of like, I remember why people hated when I did vector autoaggression. They were just kind of like, so what's going on? I'm like, I could give you some temporal kind of explanation, but I'm like, I think someone wanted more. And I think actually what's interesting is you have an opportunity to kind of set that up. Kind of like the Ring Ramirez bit, right? I wish you drew upon that a little bit more. The Ring Ramirez thing was like, okay, well, why are these tactics and now diffusing across actors? Okay, they were looking at individual tactics. You're able to kind of talk about tactical repertoires and for states and challengers. But I feel, again, disempowered from the beginning of the paper to kind of read through those dynamics that you get me to later. And I have suggestions.
Okay. So that was a lot before we turn it over, Howard, but I do totally agree that these were actually all together on the same point, which is that we were talking about how to root this paper in a way that will draw people in. So if you would like to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. These are really great comments. I think they're link it in several. They're stated a different way, but they're linked to like 2 or 3 main points. First, to Christian's point, I think networks is a data-driven method that helped me to see what are the patterns of interaction. And what I'm trying to do, but not doing a good job in this paper, I think, is trying to assign a meaning for the clusters. I tried to do it in Egypt examples, saying that in 2008, the cluster is more like a conflict deterrence by mobilizing police and arresting people. But in other years, it was conflict escalation. So I was trying to assign meaning to this cluster, but not doing it really well in terms of not specifying the proper nouns, not specifying the tactic well, not really giving a solid example. So I think this is something I really need to do. And one limitation in the current data usage is that since the data does not have the sequence of actions, it only gives me the co-occurrence of actions. It limits my ability to draw further inference of what's going on in sequence. But it's not the method itself problem, it's a data itself problem. So I'm writing right now, working on an extension of this method, and I have the sequence of action in one event. So the network will be directed. So all the edges between the nodes will have arrows. I think that can give you more solid meaning of what the protest was trying to do and what government was reacting. So that will give me a much better or solid sense of telling a story. What are the co-evolution? I think Christian was kind of saying, and I'm going to do that. And the comments on conceptualization is definitely something I'm trying to address, because I have 2 versions of this paper. I think both versions give me limited space on expanding the explanation on conceptualizing a theory. Because like this paper, I think 2 parts. So the first part is about introducing this framework, and second part is the application of it, prediction and election. But I think what I really need to do is in the front end to speak to the theory better. So what are the key efforts that in the literature people trying to solve in terms of repression-dissent? And I think that speaks to what Yang was saying, use literature as a way to theorize your work so that people can envision, oh, cluster of action can actually represent a kind of equilibrium strategies. That was in my mind, but I wasn't saying very clearly. So like, we see in some time span that some actions like police arresting people or mobilizing or arresting people, these are equilibrium strategy with protests. But in other time, it was not. It was acceleration or violence by both sides is equilibrium. So I think I want to do a better job in terms of theorizing the concept of network into this puzzle. That's another point. And I definitely agree that endogeneity is not a language I really want to use, because I'm not doing causality in this paper at all. What I really do is interdependency. I try to mine the co-occurrence of actions. I do not really know what actions leads to another in different time sequences, but what I can do is to mine the equilibrium or clusters. So in my second version, I would definitely avoid the endogeneity kind of language and trying to actually just motivate this network method more deeply.
I love that idea of turning it entirely.
Yeah.
Should I turn it over? Okay, so I've got Jan, Christian, Jackie, and Chris.
Okay, just a quick suggestion to follow up on this. Network analysis it's it's actually also theory. And I think one shortcoming, but also one opportunity you have, is that in the paper you're using the methods without grounding it in theory. And I think you could do better on that. And I think reactions like Christians, this is why I hate network analysis, are common in part because a lot of times people use network analysis as a method, and they draw pretty pictures and everything really gets complex. But without grounding it in the theory, people don't have the tools to understand what these methods are doing. But I think this is a fixable problem.
Excellent. Christian.
I definitely agree with Jan. It's definitely fixable. But part of it is kind of like, think of your language even when you talk about it, right? So you say co-occurrence. That for me is just like stuff happened at the same time. So then I'm like, there's no story there, man. I'm just like, that's why I like repertoire, right? Repertoire is just like, I've selected this group of tactics from all tactics possible because I think it's just right and appropriate for reaching a particular end. That's very different from co-occurrence. So you need to get me to repertoire and away from co-occurrence, because co-occurrence is like in line with the a-theoretical network approach, but repertoire sticks you knee deep in, well, why that combination? And I think that's where you want to be. You want to be in that why that combination. It's not random, it's intentional, but toward what end? And I think that's the thing that you could push on. And that's the thing that really becomes, I think, the major contribution, right? And I think you're also right. So I wasn't quite clear until you just said it a second ago, that you had kind of co-occurrence within a particular time spot, but not across time. And I was trying to, the minute you showed me 2008, and then I'm looking for 2009, I'm looking for sequence, right? And so I think narratively, you need to guide the reader in terms of like better managing expectations, because I was looking for sequence the minute you showed me 2008. I'm just like, okay, so what happened before or after? Where's this going? How does this evolve? And so I think you need to kind of control me a little bit more. But while I'm going on with things suck, I'm just like, articles suck, man. This is why you need to book this. This is the book. I mean, like, this is, and you're trying to jam a whole bunch of stuff into one location. And I'm ready to go with you, because yes, professionally, you probably need some articles, but this is why articles suck, man. This is just like, because each point is like, okay, so what's the repertoire? Okay, what's the actions? Okay, what are the different sides? Okay, what's the decision rule that's kind of like guiding what their different tactical combinations could be? That's at least 20 pages a piece, and you're jamming yourself into 30. So I definitely want to encourage you to do the book. I understand this is going to move forward in some version. But to clarify, I was not one of the people that rejected it previously, but it's
a good clarification. Jackie.
This is so perfect. So building on Jan's point about grounding concepts in the literature, which I think is a broader point we're talking about, and then Christian's 2 points: one, focus on repertoires, and two, books are better for this stuff. I feel like there's a generation of relevant literature that's not here. And Christian commended you at the beginning for going back farther than 10 years. And I want to do that as well. But I also want to say I'm shocked that Christian didn't also push you and point out that people have done repertoires and people have done tactical substitution. And you don't cite Lischbach, and you don't cite Tilly, or Earl, or Della Porta, or Gupta, Singer, and Sprague, or any of this stuff. So if you go back to that Moore piece and you look at all the stuff that he's citing, all of that can help you. All of that is about repertoires of violence and choices of tactics. And all texture.
Okay, that's good. Chris.
My point's related to what Jackie just said. And I wanted to push back slightly on the comment that you need to reduce the language about endogeneity at the beginning. I don't think you need to motivate it as a puzzle. I think there's lots of work that's directly addressed that theoretically. But what you're doing is you're acknowledging that the relationship between repression and dissent is strategic and difficult to unpack empirically. But you're not trying to find causal effects. You're trying to provide us I think with a richer empirical view of what the higher level actions that are embedded in these theories actually mean tactically on the ground. And so there's some formal theory work that you could go to and then think about which actions or which tactics map onto the actions that those theories have. Or you could go to this repertoires literature that Jackie just recommended and say, how are the people who are talking about repertoires thinking about bundles of tactics? When do those tactics go together? When do they not go together? And so I think there's several different pathways that you could go to where you could just assume that this relationship, this higher level relationship, conceptual relationship with dissent repression is endogenous, and you're trying to understand descriptively how we break that down, given different theoretical understandings about the process as it unfolds from the repertoires literature, from the formal theory literature.
Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, so I think I really like the idea of theoretically more grounded explanation of what you're doing, and I'm going to do. But one question and one question I'm struggling with is I want to consult you guys because I read all your work and trying to build my work and speak to your work. But what I'm kind of struggling is, what is this paper? So kind of echoing to Christian's point, I think this is a starting, it's the first episode of my series of papers. Because in this paper, I think what I try to do is introduce this framework, this approach to rethink about how to study the nexus. And in the second episode of my paper, which I'm writing right now, is diving into one specific tactics. I look at police arrest and how police arrest could bridge low violent action to higher level of violence. So I can see several different episodes like of this paper, but what I'm really struggling is how to situate this paper. Is this a method paper, or is this a substantive paper, or what kind of paper you guys think this paper is in terms of contribution? Because I'm kind of not sure about it as I'm writing right now. When I was trying to incorporate different suggestions.
Thoughts on that? Yeah, Jackie.
Unmute. This is going to sound like I'm whiffing, but I'm not. My response to that question is, think of this as your coming out paper. This is the paper that's establishing your identity as an academic. Who do you want to be? Like, what community do you want to be identified with? And when people think Howard Liu, what do you want them to think about? And that answer is going to help you figure this out, I think.
That's an excellent answer, Christian.
So, for me, I was trying to figure out what your connection was between the different explorations that you have, right? Why substitutions, types of repression, and spiral of anti-government behavior. Now, if you could more clearly specify for me that progression, because I'm like, why not one? Or is the order off? So it's like, okay, you jump from types of state repression to spiraling or escalations of challenging behavior. I'm like, so why not spirals of government behavior and types of challenging behavior? So I didn't understand how I think you have an idea actually as to what that progression is, but I think if you can articulate what that progression is better, then this paper will then cohere more for me. And I think that might reveal some of the tying together that Jan was talking about, that could tie together some of the things that Jacqueline's hinting about as well. And I think, so if you could answer that question, what is that progression an instance of? I think that will help you provide the identity for this particular piece. But at present, I felt like the Monty Python thing, and now for something completely different. And I'm just like, okay, and I'm ready to go with the ride, right? Because I like you, and I'm ready to invest, right? And we got something else going on the side, so I'm just like, I'm more than supportive. But I was kind of like, how do we get here, dude? And then, because I was like, alternative orientation, you kind of end. I'm like, I'm into conflict cycles now, right? Onset, escalation, de-escalation, termination, recurrence. I'm like, that sounds like it could overlap somewhat with your ideas, but you didn't talk about that until like later on. And then alternative aspects, right? You got kill versus intimidate, constrain versus terrorize. There's a whole bunch of different things you could pay attention to. So why'd you pick the 3 that you did? And you clarified that for me, and I think then your paper has a better identity.
Okay.
I would only add on to this, kind of in the way that Jackie did, which is in a very general comment, which is that I think that it will have that as a method, which is really what you're doing, is you're saying that we need to use a different method for understanding this if we want to understand a particular thing. But that method, that statement is only going to be useful if we can see why it substantively matters. So I think that as a methodological paper, it's going to be the most successful if you can bring in any reader and show them why they would use it, which is almost always a substantive question as opposed to a technical question. So unfortunately, that answer doesn't say this is a methods paper or a substance paper. It's that it's only useful as a methods paper if you can connect it to the substance. Christian.
So you can be successful with having this be a methodologically oriented paper, but I'll be damned if I want to see another one, because I think retrogressively we're going backwards in terms of our theoretical orientation. So I definitely want to push you to kind of identify what that theoretical contribution is and then kind of like move forward from that. Because this is the kind of like strength of weak ties moment of Granovetter, right? That piece is theoretically grounded. It doesn't have any of the tools necessarily that you have, but it does have this idea, or similar to kind of Bob's evolutional cooperation. You're in the space now where you can have a fundamentally important theoretical contribution and show and demonstrate how it can be done empirically. And I'm just like, that's just a powerful combination. So I want to push you to do that, because it's unfortunate how things are going right now, but you could get this published as a substantively weak methods piece. But I'm just like, I think that's a pathology of the current profession, and not necessarily something that we need as a society to figure out exactly what things are driving what.
People may think differently about the way I'm interpreting this, but I think this is what makes Chris Farris's APSR so successful, is that he's giving us a methodological advancement, but what that advancement does is tell us that we have been understanding the way that we can see violence. We're getting that all wrong, right? And the way that people interpret violence is all wrong. So anyway, Chris Fariss.
Thanks for that compliment, Emily.
You're welcome.
So I have a contradictory statement, which I think is consistent with what Christian and Emily just said. It's not contradictory to me, but it might sound contradictory. I'd like to see more technical detail, but I'd actually like you to minimize the paper as a methods piece. Like I think the methodological detail is important and necessary, but I don't know if it needs to be the primary focal point of the paper. So like I'd like to see much more detail about how you aggregate the information to construct the network, what the equations are that go into that, more figures that show the process as you build different pieces of information that you put together. That's all stuff that's interesting to me and helps me as a reader, but most of that I'd like to see in an appendix. And like I think the substantive goals of the paper are much more worthwhile as the focal point of the paper. And I think that's consistent with the last two comments. So
it is, at least with mine. Jackie.
So echoing all of this and adding to it, the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that it's a substantive paper and not a methods paper, for all of the reasons other people have said. But also, if I'm reviewing this as a methods reviewer, like if I get this from PA, like that's not, my question then is, what's the contribution, right? Because what you're doing is taking a method and applying it in an area that it hasn't been applied before, and presenting it in a way that is new. but that's not a methods paper in the classical sense of like a methodologist and you're going to take this to Polmouth as a poster. And so I really do think that the substantive contribution is so big and the methodological application is so valuable that you can think of it as applying a sophisticated method to a really important substantive question. And that will get you where you want to be.
Yeah.
But then don't send it to PA.
But then don't send it to PA. Those reviewers are super mean.
Some people suggest me to go to PA, but I was really kind of reluctant because I really think this is a substantive paper. But some people say this is a method paper. So I think the problem is on me, not really specifying the audience. Yeah.
But I think you have plenty of opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a new point from Christian.
Okay, so this is a two-parter. One is fairly straightforward, and you could just probably say yes or no. Does your approach allow you to identify networks across nations and regions? The U.S. has been intricately connected with training police and military and counter-movement activities around the globe, but that then, are you presuming that things are taking place within nation states? And is this approach, can you identify, for example, as this is historical, can you identify, for example, all the places that the U.S. has trained people to see if there's similarities with regards to how they respond?
Yeah.
Is that what, okay, that's cool. But you want to highlight that, man, because right now you're just assuming, or you seem to be articulating that this is taking place within individual nation states. And this is identifying a whole new way that we could gauge these similarities across space and time, which is huge. So major underselling, and I was not sure if that was the case. So you definitely want to kind of like go there. And maybe that's a potential spin-off piece, which is kind of like, we've been making these presumptions about kind of like behaviors, are they stable within nations? But actually, we need to be looking at other types of networks across the globe, in as far as we can gauge who's been training whom. And that, I think, the School of the Americas example, I think, is very useful for kind of like, if you attended the School of Americas, your tactics should be comparable to other graduates if you're basically following this. And I think that would be a major contribution as well. So I think that's something else that you could highlight as something that you could do. My other comment is, what's up with the data, man? So I'm just like, all right, okay, NAVCO is interested in resistance and not repression, right? So I'm like, okay, so what's up with that? You need a data set that's equally interesting in both sides. So does it have implications for what it is that you're studying, given that this project is fundamentally interested in resistance, and then they're looking at, oh, well, were they repressed, as an afterthought, as a backup point, which means that, are they catching the stuff that's ahead of time that led to the mobilization? They're clearly catching the stuff during, of certain forms. But I'm like, who the heck's the AFP? What's their history?
AFP?
Yeah, I mean, I know who they are, but I'm like, who are they? I'm just like, there's a whole literature on the New York Times and who's on the editorial board and what's the content? How's it come up? This is news related. You have no comments whatsoever about news bias, media controls. You're just using AFP related source from NAVCO and running with it. And I'm just kind of like, who the hell is NAVCO and who the hell is AFP? And why do you have no media controls in your database? Is it possible that Francophone countries have different dynamics than non-Francophone? Are we presuming that NAVCO did this? Which I don't think they did. So I'm just like, if you'd like me to go on board to trust anything that you have to say, and yes, we've had an interesting conversation, but I'm just like, I have no reason to trust anything that you said, given what NAVCO has done. And having to invoke will, I'm just kind of like, in a will-like sense, you don't have actual repression or dissent. You have assertions or allegations of repression or dissent. And if that's the case, then what does that mean for the tactical dynamics that you're saying when they're provided by a news source that you've completely bracketed out of this conversation? Now, I say that acknowledging that Beth Simmons, Catherine Sickink, and a bunch of other people that do human rights stuff don't deal with this stuff at all. And this is part of our pathology that we actually talk about it. But since we're here, we could talk about it. But I acknowledge you have professional reasons for not talking about it.
Fariss.
Just one suggestion that might help you address what Christian just said is so the NAVCO data set is interesting, and it has features that are potentially useful to measure different aspects of society in different forms of dissenting behavior. And so you could take some time and do a book chapter, if you followed Christian's advice, or another paper, and instead of trying to hook this with like a large conceptual issue that the discipline faces or the peace science community faces, you could say, what can we measure from this data set? That's something I did in early work. Like the paper you cite with Schnackenberg was more about like, what can we measure using this tool from this Siri data? Like what can we learn using this new measurement technique with data that we know a lot about? So you could take sort of a sidestep and think about what can we measure from NAVCO using these tools? And what can we learn about the patterns in that data set? And then that would give you an opportunity, either in chapter or article form, to spend much more time talking about the features and the bugs that are come along with that data set. And that would be a good paper or chapter once it's written that you could then build off of and say, well, what's missing? What do we need to add to this data set to actually get at these larger conceptual issues that the field is trying to address, which is, I think, how you lead the paper in. So that's just a suggestion, and that could be really valuable exercise, even if it ultimately doesn't end up in print. Okay.
Christian.
My quick follow-up was, so from my media bias book perspective of we need to pay more attention to sources, what your analysis ends up telling us is that prior news coverage influences subsequent news coverage, and that's a lot less interesting. So you need to get me out of source mode and get me closer to some ground truth.
Howard.
So I'm trying to understand. So the events are reported by media, and you're definitely right that some media biases should be addressed. And I kind of address it in a different way. So I got some comments from people saying that maybe you are doing good in prediction because the countries you are focusing on are just very eventful. So because they are eventful, they attract many media attention, so that you are doing good in forecasting more events by media. So I kind of take two steps. One step is that I subset the data into two groups. One group is less eventful, because NAVCO is trying to balance the media attention thing. So they also code some countries that does not have a lot of events. So I have two subsets, and my prediction is still doing well, saying that if we account for the interdependence, we can still prevent well regardless of media coverage or eventful or eventless. I think I kind of trying to address this problem, but I'm not really sure it is what exactly Christian suggest me to do. But that was my one effort. And another effort is that I don't really think, if I ground this paper as a measurement from NAVCO, I think it kind of limits its potential, because I think it can apply to many different data sets in terms of studying repression-dissent. So I actually applied it to a different data set, which is mass mobilization data set, which indicate what kind of protest issue will be facing different types of repression. So I guess I'm not really sure if I want to ground this paper as a measurement to one data, but maybe that was something I really did think about it.
Christian, Jackie, Fariss.
So I'm not advocating that you do that. And in fact, nobody other than our small ass community would want to read that. But you're going to need to address it in some way, shape, or form. And so this is, so you could have successful books, right? So Simmons, Sicking, they got books with like hardly any discussion whatsoever of any data, right? Even Emily Hafner Burton, they do the same stuff. Books don't want to hear this. But I'm saying, I think existentially we're caught in a little area, right? Because we do care about whether or not these things are actually capturing some aspect of reality. And we do care whether or not that narrativity is playing a role, right? So there's a way of reading this particular piece, which is things co-occur because they're better stories. And so your co-occurrence is AFP, a journalist at AFP going, oh, yo, this story is really great. I've identified these things. And oh, guess what? They relate to the next thing. Oh, but we have a different journalist there. So he didn't follow up with these 6 things being present. He focused on these 2, and that's just what he writes. So I'm just like, we could get at some of this stuff because we have information on whether or not it was a journalist, but if it's a wire, that comes a little bit harder. So I'm not suggesting we go down that rabbit hole, but that rabbit hole is present, right? And so some folks have tried to figure out some of the measurement source bias issues and map that to reality so that we can just run. Because most people just want to hear about reality, and that's where the biggest audience is. And there's a small group that cares about sources and what's going on there. There's another group that cares about sources and the connection to reality. So these are different audiences in many respects. But I don't think I'd feel completely at ease if I did not even mention that, okay, it would be nice to know something about AFP. It would be nice to know that you did the type of things that you did and have that kind of explicitly referenced. But there is another element here, which is there's stories of contention that are being told that is co-occurrence, right? So Octavia Butler is engaging in co-occurrence with regards to talking about certain types of things. And as her story evolves, the different co-occurrence will evolve. Well, you're not thinking about this in terms of narrativity. You're talking about this in terms of actual contentious politics. But that narrativity part of me is just like, I kind of want to highlight it, but I acknowledge there's really no space for it. And by us ceding the field to Pinker and other individuals to just go on and talk about reality without having to address about any of this data stuff, I think these need to be working in concert. But professionally, you don't have a reason for doing it. But as we're in this kind of bubble for a moment to kind of talk about it, I'm like, it will be useful to acknowledge that. And if you could figure that out, that would be useful to kind of signal how it's not narrativity and how it's reality. You could figure out how to divide that. That would be amazingly important and a significant contribution.
I've got Jackie and Fariss, and then I want to make some time for one more new point.
Yeah, the will voice in my head is screaming so loud, Christian, to stop saying he doesn't have to go there. Like, it's so loud. You don't have to go there to have a career, but if you're a scholar who wants to ask questions and find the answers, then you have to go there. Most people want to hear about reality and not talk about sources, but they want to accept that the reality you're talking about is the real reality. Most people want the real evidence and the real answers, especially most social scientists. And so you don't have to solve this problem. But you have to think about this problem because it's real and it's affecting how you answer the questions that you're asking. And the problem is that allegations and events are not the same thing, and we equate them in our work. Right? You're talking about events that happen and comparing these events to those events, but what you're really talking about is reports about events. And those things are only the same if every event that occurs gets reported and every reported event is reported accurately. And that's not this world. And so all the stuff Christian said, except for the part where you don't have to think about it. You don't have to solve it, but we all have to think about it.
Yes.
Chris Fariss.
So just to return to my 2 point, my suggestion isn't to change this paper, but it's to think about what other auxiliary writings could you do that you could use the information from to help resolve some of the issues that have been raised here. So like what could you learn from measuring things out of NAVCO and make it a NAVCO-centric chapter or article? That would be useful for some of the discussion here in supporting the paper we're talking about. So I don't want to, I'm not saying change this paper. I think that's an important point. Can I go to my 1 now, or do I need to wait?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
In the you didn't talk about this in the presentation, but in the paper, there's the first half is focused. You've to spend time talking about substitution, and then in the latter half, and I think the second, the election empirical analysis, you talk about complementarity, and those 2 things are different in terms of how tactics co-occur or not co-occur, and I think there just needs to be. I I don't know what I learned about those two processes or those two ways of grouping tactics from the paper, and I'd just like to see more either organization in the paper about how you deal with that. And that might require you to focus on one versus the other. It could be that you need to go back to the data and spend some more time with that, sort of in the NavCode data set appendix or chapter or auxiliary paper that we're talking about. But I want more information about what we learned empirically about those two forms of grouping, and then how that goes into the subsequent analysis.
Howard.
Oh, I'm just a thumbs up.
Oh,
I agree.
Okay. Jan had a couple of points.
Yeah, just a few things that are secondary in nature. In the section leading up to the network analysis, you talk a lot about structural equivalence. But then what you end up measuring is you're maximizing modularity, which is different operationally and conceptually. So I was a little bit confused by that section because they're both forms of clustering, but they mean different things, and they're measured differently. Two other secondary things. You have civil liberties as a control in your models, but that's a form of repression, or lack of. So I was a little bit confused by that, and maybe this is something to clarify in the paper, or maybe if there's time you can clarify it now. And then the last thing, when you talk about prevention early on, you referenced Courtney and Emily's paper. There's more stuff you could cite on prevention. Jaworski and Dragu have an APSR that just came out on preventive repression, and then they cite some other stuff that might be useful to you.
Yeah, that's a great paper. Howard?
Yeah, just quickly respond. Yeah, I would definitely cite the just new upcoming preventive repression paper on APSR. And actually, you're right. I think summer control, because I was trying to predict state repression, and some of the aggregate country level civil liberty controls are kind of correlated with that. I probably shouldn't incorporate it. But there are other covariates can be incorporated, such as foreign intervention or other stuff. So I think there's more to be done in terms of incorporating standard covariates as my baseline, which I'm doing in the next iteration. Yeah, thank you.
Christian.
So preemptive repression, there's a piece with Neil and myself. I'm like, people are like rolling now. It's funny how stuff comes to my table. I'm just like, okay, really? All right, so you have a pivot from kind of like general processes to like electoral contexts. And I'm just like, this electoral violence pivot is really fascinating for me, because I'm just like, what about the rest of the context? What's so special about elections? Yes, it's in vogue at the moment, but what types of conflicts takes place around elections? Is an election an instance of state power or state weakness? I mean, it's like all this stuff is kind of, I wasn't ready to go with you on your electoral like pivot just without any kind of comment whatsoever. Similarly, where's accommodation in your story? If I understand, so NABCO, back to them again, right? They use Cameo, acknowledging that was two or three versions back of what Phil came up with last week. But so I'm just like, so what have you lost by using the older version of what Phil came up with 10 years ago, first off? But where's accommodation in the story from the perspective of you set this as a repression-dissent kind of dynamic, as opposed to if it's a repertoire versus repertoire dynamic, then you got accommodation and kind of coercion on both sides. And so I think your reframing needs to kind of get you back to this general thing. And that was us.
Howard.
Yeah, I think Christian was right. But his comment reminds me a question that was bouncing in my head. I want to consult you guys. I got some suggestions saying that I should keep the first part, which is the network framework introduction and prediction, as a single isolated paper, and kick out the election part as a different paper. Do guys think that there's a viable strategy and use more space to elaborate on theoretical contribution or theoretical concept of network? Or you guys think that it should be a paper that incorporate the first part on prediction, network, and also election?
Christian says yes.
I don't like the election violence stuff. I think it's crap. I just think it's just like we've lost out of elections. It's not just a focal point. It's also an instance of state power and ability to get done what it wants to do, and then channel and suck individuals in and bring them in and make them think that they have a say and think that they wait 4 to 8 years before other things get done. The politics of elections seem to be gone by this election, oh, it's a special period kind of thing.
Anyone else weigh in on this?
I had a similar reaction with the election violence in the paper. It seemed like a different paper to me. And it seems like there's so much more that you could develop on the other parts of the paper yeah, I agree with making that a separate piece. It doesn't fit, and it's taking up space that you could use to do better on the front
end. Chris?
And also pragmatically, it highlights the issue with the distinction between complementarity and substitution that you might want to, that might be really important for this paper, but it might also be something that's worth exploring in more detail in its own right. So that's another way to think about organizing this stuff. But I had a similar reaction to Jan and Christian. Okay. Inevitably, you'll get a reviewer that says they want it back in, and you'll have to put it back in later. But that's something you deal with down the road.
So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I think that there's probably lots more that all of us could say, and hopefully everybody will email Howard with their thought, anything else that they've got on the paper. I want to thank everybody so much for participating. This was super fun. This is, obviously one of my favorite groups, but I really appreciate everybody participating and reading and being really thoughtful. We got to have really great conversations. Thank you, Howard, for sharing your paper with us. As a reminder to everyone who's watching, you can watch this over and over again because obviously it was amazing, but you can also find the paper on the online Peace Science Colloquium website and also on Howard's website. And finally, I want to thank everyone for watching over a while. I've been the I definitely am the dictator. I have been the director of the online Peace Science Colloquium, and I created it 4 years ago. And this is my last one. So I'm turning this over to Cassie Dorff and Brad Smith, who will co-direct it starting next year. And this has been so much fun, and I have loved it so much. And this conversation that we had today is exactly why I have loved it so much. And so I really appreciate that this particular one was my last one. And I also, while I'm doing this, I want to thank Christian and the late Will Moore, who gave everybody this idea in the first place. Conflict Consortium established in 2013. And the Conflict Consortium was a direct influence on everything that we do here. And I love Christian and miss Will for giving this to us. So thank you to all. Thanks for all of the watchers, the viewers, and everybody who has participated over the last 4 years. And everybody should keep participating for Cassie and Brad when they take over in the fall. So love y'all, and thanks for watching.
Thank you. Thank you.